Welcome back, my friend. Today we will dive deep into what kind of world gives birth to a society like Sparta. Now, relax your body and try to have a good night's sleep. To understand their story, you have to go back more than 3,000 years to the twilight of the Mycenaean Age. These early Greeks, the people of Agamemnon and the Trojan War legends, once filled the land with palaces, gold, and epic heroes. But around 1200 BCE, their world collapsed in fire and chaos. Palaces burned, trade networks shattered, and entire kingdoms vanished. Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages, a time when writing disappeared, populations shrank, and survival itself became a struggle. It was out of this collapse that new tribes began to spread across the Greek world. Among them were the Dorians, a tougher, warlike people who pushed into the southern Peloponnese. They settled in a fertile valley along the Eurotas River, surrounded on all sides by mountains. This land was both a gift and a curse. On one hand, the natural barriers made invasion almost impossible. Sparta was a fortress without walls. On the other, isolation meant they had little contact with the outside world. While Athens would one day become a hub of trade, art, and philosophy, the Spartans grew apart, focused inward, and slowly developed a way of life unlike anyone else in Greece. In these early centuries, Sparta wasn't yet the military machine we imagine. It was simply one of many Dorian settlements struggling to survive in a hard world. But that isolation, that sense of living apart from others, planted the seed of something unique. Where other city-states built fleets or sought wealth overseas, the Spartans looked inward and decided survival meant discipline, unity, and strength above everything else. This choice, to reject the easy path of trade or colonization and instead harden themselves into a warrior society, set Sparta on a course that would make them both feared and legendary. Imagine Greece in the year 1200 BCE. Palaces tower over the hills, filled with gold and treasures from distant lands. Chariots roll across the plains, and kings boast of their power in epic poems. This was the world of the Mycenaeans, the age that gave us legendary figures like Agamemnon and Menelaus, warriors whose names echo through the Iliad and Odyssey. But just as quickly as their glory rose, it all came crashing down. Around 1200 BCE, the entire Mycenaean world collapsed in fire and ruin. Historians still debate why. Was it foreign invaders, internal rebellion, natural disasters, or a chain reaction of all three? Whatever the cause, their palaces burned, their kingdoms fell, and Greece was plunged into what we now call the Dark Ages. For centuries, the land lay in shadows, populations shrank, trade routes disappeared, and writing itself was forgotten. The Greece of Homer's heroes was gone, and in its place came a harsher, smaller world. It was during this time that a new wave of Greeks, known as the Dorians, began spreading across the Peloponnese. Unlike the old Mycenaean lords, these Dorians were simpler, tougher, and far more warlike. They didn't build vast palaces or chase wealth across the seas. They were conquerors, and they carried with them a different vision of life. Among these, Dorian settlers was a group that took root in a fertile valley in the southern Peloponnese. Along the banks of the Eurotas River. The land here was rich, but the valley itself was ringed by towering mountains. On one side, the Taygetus Range rose like a wall. On another, the Parnon Mountains formed a barrier against the outside world. This geography gave the settlement a strange advantage. Unlike Athens, Corinth, or other coastal cities, Sparta was protected by nature itself. Invaders would find it almost impossible to break through the mountains, and the valley floor provided enough farmland to support the people within. But this protection came with a price: isolation. While Athens grew into a trading hub that welcomed merchants and new ideas from across the Mediterranean, Sparta stayed apart. The mountains weren't just walls of stone, they were cultural walls too. The Spartans had little reason to look outward, so they looked inward instead. And that inward focus would shape everything about who they became. At first, Sparta wasn't all that different from other Greek communities. They farmed, worshipped their gods, and fought the occasional skirmish with neighbors. But life in the Eurotas Valley taught a simple, brutal lesson. Survival required unity, and unity required strength. Every weak link threatened the chain. Every division could shatter the community. And slowly, the Spartans began to mold themselves into something unique. While other Greeks built fleets to cross the seas or established colonies in foreign lands, the Spartans made a different choice. They weren't going to expand outward through ships or trade. They would expand by force. Their solution to problems wasn't negotiation or compromise. It was discipline and war. This decision didn't just make them different, it made them dangerous. Sparta's early centuries were a time of trial and transformation. Small wars with neighboring tribes taught them the value of coordination. Harsh conditions taught them to prize toughness over comfort, and that sense of living apart from the rest of Greece made them suspicious of outsiders, determined to keep their way of life pure and uncorrupted. It was a small city, but it carried within it the seeds of a revolution in how a society could be built. Sparta's origins, then, weren't just about geography or survival. They were about identity. From the very beginning, they set themselves on a path that no other Greek city dared to follow. They chose to build not a marketplace of ideas, but a forge for warriors, not a democracy of many voices, but a community bound together by discipline and silence. This was the birth of Sparta, a society born in the shadows of collapse, hardened by isolation, and destined to redefine what it meant to live and die for one's people. If Sparta's isolation and harsh beginnings shaped its identity, it was the creation of its system that defined its destiny. No city in Greece, not even mighty Athens, lived by rules as radical as those of the Spartans. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To the Spartans, it was survival. At the heart of this transformation was a figure cloaked in legend, Lycurgus, the so-called lawgiver of Sparta. No one knows if Lycurgus was a real man or just a myth, but in the stories told by later generations, he traveled far and wide, studied foreign lands, and returned to Sparta with a vision: to strip away corruption, greed, and weakness, and instead create the most disciplined society the world had ever seen. The reforms attributed to Lycurgus became known as the Great Retra, Sparta's unwritten constitution. Unlike Athens, where politics meant fiery speeches in the marketplace, Sparta's system was built for stability and obedience. At its core was the belief that every Spartan existed not for himself, but for the survival of the state. The structure was unlike anything else in Greece. Sparta had not one king, but two, one from the Aegean line and one from the Eurypontid line. This dual kingship was strange even by ancient standards, but it gave Sparta a unique balance. One king could lead the army to war, while the other stayed home to guard against unrest. Neither could seize total power, and that kept the monarchy in check. Above them stood the Gerousia, a council of elders, men over 60, hardened veterans who carried both experience and authority. They served for life, guardians of tradition and advisors to the kings. And then came the ephors, 5 elected officials with extraordinary power. The ephors could challenge kings, command armies, and even oversee daily life. Imagine that, in a city known for kings, it was often these 5 men who truly held the reins. Finally, there was the Apella, the assembly of Spartan citizens. They could vote on proposals, but their role was limited compared to Athens' democracy. Sparta was no place for long debates or fiery rhetoric. Theirs was a system of obedience, not persuasion, but politics was only part of the revolution. The real genius, or cruelty, of Sparta's system lay in how it solved its most dangerous problem, manpower. Unlike Athens, which sent colonists across the seas to find new land, Sparta chose conquest. To their west lay Messenia, a fertile land perfect for farming. Sparta invaded, conquered, and turned the entire Messenian population into helots, a class of state-owned serfs. The helots worked the farms, grew the crops, and fed the Spartan state. This gave Sparta something extraordinary, a warrior class freed from the burdens of labor. While the helots tilled the soil, the Spartan citizens could devote themselves entirely to war. But there was a cost. The helots outnumbered their Spartan masters by as much as 7 to 1. Imagine living every day surrounded by people who hated you, waiting for a chance to rise up. The Spartans did not just conquer Messenia, they chained themselves to a system of permanent fear. To keep control, they had to become harsher, stricter, more disciplined than any other people alive. And so, the laws of Sparta were designed for a single purpose: to hold the state together, no matter the cost. Land, for example, was redistributed to ensure that each Spartan citizen had enough to support himself and his place in the warrior class. Wealth, luxury, and individual ambition were stripped away. Private life barely existed. What mattered was the community, and above all, the readiness to fight. This was the essence of Sparta's system, a society where the individual disappeared into the collective, where every law, every institution, every custom pushed its citizens toward the same end: strength, unity, and obedience. It was a system admired by some, feared by many, and hated by those forced to live beneath it. But one thing was certain: it worked. Sparta survived. Sparta grew. And Sparta began to turn ordinary children into extraordinary soldiers. If the laws of Sparta gave the city its structure, the Agogsh gave it its soul. No other Greek city dared to raise its children the way Sparta did, because no other city was willing to sacrifice so much of individual freedom in the name of collective strength. For the Spartans, childhood wasn't about play, discovery, or self-expression. It was about survival, endurance, and loyalty to the state. The journey of every Spartan boy began with a test, literally at birth. When an infant was born, it wasn't the family who decided if he would live. The elders of the tribe inspected the child, looking for signs of weakness, deformity, or frailty. A baby judged too weak for the future they demanded was left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. To the Spartans, this wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. They believed the survival of the community depended on strength alone, and there was no room for those who couldn't endure. For those who survived, the real trial began at the age of 7. At this age, Spartan boys were taken from their families and placed into the Agogj, a training system unlike anything the world had ever seen. From that moment forward, their lives no longer belonged to their parents. They belonged to Sparta. The barracks became their new home. There were no soft beds, no comforts, no family warmth. Instead, they were drilled in obedience, endurance, and toughness. Discipline was harsh, sometimes brutal. A boy caught speaking too much could be flogged. A boy who disobeyed could be beaten by his peers. It wasn't about punishment, it was about forging habits of silence, restraint, and respect for authority. Food was deliberately scarce. Boys were often left hungry, not by accident, but by design. Hunger taught them resourcefulness. They were encouraged to steal food from gardens or fields, but if caught, the punishment was severe. The lesson wasn't don't steal, it was don't get caught. Cunning was as valuable as strength, because in war, both could mean survival. Training was constant. Wrestling, running, javelin, spear drills. Every day their bodies were hardened, their minds sharpened. Endurance was prized above all. They marched barefoot, wore a single cloak through heat and cold, and were expected to endure pain without complaint. One famous story tells of a Spartan boy who stole a fox to eat, hid it under his cloak, and let the animal tear at his flesh rather than reveal his theft. By the time he collapsed, he was already dying from his wounds. To the Spartans, this was proof of character. Pain could be endured, but dishonor could not. But the Agogsh wasn't only about physical toughness. It was also about shaping the mind. Boys were trained in music, poetry, and especially in laconic speech, the sharp, witty brevity that Spartans became famous for. Words, like movements in battle, had to be precise, efficient, and deadly. Long speeches were for Athenians. Spartans learned to deliver cutting replies in as few words as possible, a skill that would become legendary across Greece. At age 20, after more than a decade of training, a Spartan youth became a hoplite, a full-time soldier of the state. But even then, his life didn't return to his family. He lived in barracks with other soldiers, ate in the Syssitia, military mess halls, where every man contributed food from his land allotment. and remained under the watchful eye of the state. It wasn't until the age of 30 that a Spartan was considered a full citizen, allowed to marry and take a seat in the assembly. Yet even then, he remained a soldier until the age of 60, and while the boys were being shaped into warriors, the girls of Sparta were also raised in ways that shocked the rest of Greece. Unlike Athenian women, who were expected to stay indoors, weave, and remain invisible in public life, Spartan women were taught to run, wrestle, throw javelins, and dance. They were expected to be strong because strong women bore strong children. They managed estates while their husbands were away. They could own land, and they were known for their independence and sharp tongues. Where an Athenian woman might be praised for silence, a Spartan woman might be praised for speaking her mind with courage. This contrast was so extreme that other Greeks often mocked Spartan women, but it gave Sparta a reputation as a place of fierce mothers and daughters. When a Spartan mother handed her son his shield before battle, she was said to command, "Come back with it," or on it. To return without the shield meant one thing, cowardice. To die upon it meant honor. In the agoge, boys were not simply raised to fight. They were raised to disappear into the phalanx, to become one piece of an unbreakable wall of shields. The system killed individuality, but gave birth to something greater: unity, discipline, and the absolute loyalty of men who had suffered and endured together since childhood. This was the essence of Sparta's training. It wasn't just preparation for war, it was war itself, waged from the moment a child drew breath. And the result was a warrior unlike any other in the ancient world. If the agoge was the furnace that forged Spartan warriors, the army was the finished blade, sharp, disciplined, and unbreakable. To the Greeks, Sparta's strength wasn't its walls, its wealth, or its culture. It was its men. As one ancient saying put it, "The walls of Sparta are her sons, and her borders are the points of their spears." The backbone of this army was the hoplite, the heavily armed infantrymen of the Greek world. Every city-state fielded hoplites, but the Spartans turned it into an art form. Each warrior carried a long spear, a short sword, and the most important piece of all, the great round shield, the aspis. The shield was heavy, about 3 feet wide, and curved to protect not just the man who held it, but the man standing beside him. In battle, a Spartan hoplite's left arm shielded his neighbor, binding the formation together like links in a chain. And when those shields locked into place, they formed the phalanx, a wall of bronze, wood, and flesh that rolled forward like a living machine, 8 rows deep, spear tips bristling. The phalanx wasn't about individual heroics. It was about unity. A single man out of place could break the entire line. That's why the Spartans trained from childhood to fight not as individuals, but as a collective, moving as one body, one mind, one unstoppable force. The discipline of the Spartan phalanx was legendary. Where other armies might falter under pressure, Spartans held firm. Ancient writers marveled at how they advanced to the sound of flutes, not shouting or screaming, but calmly, step by step, as if on parade. Imagine facing that, a wall of bronze, advancing silently, steadily, with absolute confidence. Panic often broke their enemies long before spears ever clashed. And then there was the ethos of the Spartan soldier. To the Spartans, retreat was unthinkable. Cowardice was the greatest shame, punished not only by the state, but by the scorn of one's peers. The shield, in particular, symbolized this code. A man could lose his helmet or his breastplate and still return home, but to lose his shield was disgrace. The helmet and armor protected the individual, but the shield protected the formation. Abandoning it meant betraying the group. Hence the famous command of Spartan mothers, return with your shield, or on it. Their reputation grew so fearsome that sometimes battles ended before they even began. Stories tell of enemies surrendering at the mere sight of the Spartan line. By the 6th century BCE, the Spartan army was considered the most formidable land force in Greece, an unchallenged master of the battlefield. But what made them so terrifying wasn't just their strength, it was their attitude. Spartans were masters of the laconic wit, sharp, cutting replies that revealed a confidence bordering on arrogance. When a Persian ambassador once threatened that their arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan replied, "Then we will fight in the shade." Simple, direct, and devastatingly effective. Words, like weapons, were used sparingly, but with deadly precision. It was this combination of discipline, unity, and mindset that made the Spartan army unique. They didn't build walls of stone because they believed their soldiers were enough. And for centuries, that belief proved true. The Persian Empire was unlike anything Greece had ever faced. Stretching from the Nile to the Indus, it was vast, wealthy, and ruthless. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, or so ancient sources claimed, though modern estimates suggest around 200,000. Either way, it was massive, and it was coming for Greece. In 480 BCE, King Xerxes I of Persia led this colossal force across the Hellespont, determined to crush the city-states of Greece once and for all. The Greek cities, small and often quarrelsome, had no hope alone. But Sparta, with its unbeatable land army, emerged as a leader. The stakes were simple. If the Greeks fell, their cities would be razed, their people enslaved. The battlefield was a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. Its terrain was crucial, with cliffs on one side and the sea on the other. Only a small number of soldiers could fight at once. Here, numbers mattered less than discipline, and for the Spartans, discipline was everything. King Leonidas I of Sparta led a force of roughly 7,000 Greeks, including just 300 Spartans. These men were the best of the best, each forged by the Agoge, each trained to endure pain, hunger, and fear without flinching. They knew the odds, overwhelming, yet they marched to Thermopylae with courage that would echo through history. For 3 days, the Spartans and their allies held the pass. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers attacked, only to be cut down by the unbreakable Greek line. The phalanx moved as one organism, shields locked, spears thrust, men supporting men. Every Spartan knew that falling back was not an option. Retreat was death, yes, but it was also dishonor, a concept they understood more deeply than life itself. Then, a betrayal changed everything. A Greek named Ephialtes revealed a secret mountain path to the Persians, allowing them to flank the defenders. Leonidas made a fateful decision. He dismissed most of the Greek allies to safety, staying behind with his 300 Spartans, along with 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans. They knew they were doomed, and yet they stayed. For that final stand, the Spartans fought not for glory, not for riches, but for Greece itself. They died in formation, spear in hand, shields interlocked. The Persian numbers overwhelmed them, and one by one, they fell. Leonidas himself was killed, his body surrounded by enemies. Yet their sacrifice bought crucial time for the rest of Greece to prepare defenses against Xerxes' army. The aftermath of Thermopylae was staggering. The Persians burned Athens, but the Greek navy, led by the Athenians, struck back at Salamis. By 479 BCE, the combined Greek forces defeated the Persians at Plataea, ending the invasion. The bravery of Leonidas and his men became a symbol, a story that would inspire generations for millennia. What made this moment legendary wasn't just courage, it was discipline, strategy, and the unshakable Spartan mindset. They faced impossible odds and held the line. They taught the world that the measure of a warrior was not in his numbers, but in his endurance, his loyalty, and his refusal to yield. Even their enemies recognized it. The Persians buried the fallen Spartans with honors, acknowledging the valor that no army could ignore. Thermopylae became more than a battle. It became a symbol of defiance, of sacrifice, and of a society that valued duty above life itself. Victory over Persia brought Greece a fragile peace, but it also created a new kind of tension. Athens and Sparta, once allies against a common enemy, were now the two greatest powers in Greece, and they were nothing alike. Athens was a city of wealth, art, and innovation. Its democracy allowed citizens to debate and decide policy. Its navy ruled the waves, and its influence stretched across the Aegean. Sparta, by contrast, was the ultimate land power. Its army was unmatched, its citizens disciplined from birth, and its focus on tradition and military strength left little room for culture or politics. The differences weren't just political, they were philosophical. Athens celebrated individuality, creativity, and trade. Sparta demanded conformity, sacrifice, and obedience. This rivalry was inevitable, and it erupted in what would become the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that would drag on for nearly 3 decades. The first phase, known as the Archidamian War, 431-421 BCE, was named after King Archidamus II of Sparta. Sparta relied on its unbeatable hoplite army, invading the Athenian countryside year after year. They burned crops, destroyed villages, and hoped to starve Athens into submission. But the Athenians refused to engage in open battle. They retreated behind the long walls of their city, a massive fortification connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus. From there, their superior navy allowed them to raid the Peloponnesus, striking Sparta indirectly while avoiding the lethal Spartan infantry. Then, disaster struck Athens in a way no army could prevent. Plague. In 430 BCE, a disease swept through the crowded city. killing perhaps a third of its population, including the brilliant leader Pericles. The city was devastated, morale sank, and the fragile balance of the war shifted. Yet even with Athens weakened, the first phase of the war ended inconclusively with the Peace of Nicias in 421 BCE, a truce that promised calm but delivered little. The next major episode came with the Sicilian expedition, 415 413 BCE, a bold but catastrophic Athenian gamble. Athens sent a massive fleet to Sicily to attack Syracuse, hoping to expand its empire. Sparta, seizing the opportunity, supported Syracuse secretly. The result was disaster. Athens lost thousands of soldiers and virtually its entire fleet. The expedition not only destroyed its naval power temporarily, but also handed Sparta the upper hand in the war. The final phase, known as the Ionian or Decelean War, 413-404 BCE, was a masterstroke of Spartan strategy. Sparta established a permanent garrison at Dexelia, cutting Athens off from its countryside and crippling its economy. With Persian gold, Sparta finally built a navy capable of challenging Athens at sea. Under commanders like Lysander, the Spartan fleet became a lethal instrument. In 405 BCE, the decisive Battle of Aegospotami ended the war. The Spartan navy destroyed the Athenian fleet, leaving Athens starved, isolated, and forced to surrender in 404 BCE. For a brief moment, Sparta stood as the undisputed hegemon of Greece. Its army had proven unstoppable on land, its strategy effective both at home and abroad, and its political influence unmatched. Yet this dominance came at a cost, enforcing control over Athens, imposing pro-Spartan governments, and spreading influence across the Aegean strained the very values that had made Sparta strong. Wealth and power began to corrupt the rigid simplicity that had forged the city. Sparta's clash with Athens was more than a war. It was a battle of civilizations, land versus sea, tradition versus innovation, discipline versus creativity. And while Sparta won the war, the struggle exposed vulnerabilities that would later contribute to its decline. Victory over Athens in 404 BCE placed Sparta at the height of its power, yet beneath the surface, the city-state was already fragile. The very system that had made Sparta unbeatable, the agoge, the strict laws, the reliance on helots, was now revealing its weaknesses. Strength could win battles, but it couldn't solve every problem. The first and most obvious challenge was population. The Spartan citizen class, the Spartiates, had always been small. At their peak, there may have been only around 8,000 men eligible to fight as full citizens, compared to Athens' 30,000 plus male citizens. This was tiny. Constant warfare during the Peloponnesian War, combined with the demands of the agoge, further reduced their numbers. Every death was a blow, and every lost generation made it harder to maintain the army that had once conquered all of Greece. Then there was the helot problem, the ever-present threat of rebellion. The helots vastly outnumbered the Spartiates, perhaps by 7-1. While these state-owned serfs farmed the land and fed the warriors, they were never loyal. Sparta had built its society on fear, fear of the helots, fear of weakness, fear of compromise. Every year, the Spartans conducted secret police-like operations, terrorizing the Helots to prevent uprisings. It was a delicate balance. The more the city expanded and gained wealth, the more dangerous the Helots became, and the harder the Spartans had to work to maintain control. Even the rigid Spartan values were under pressure. Wealth from Athens' tribute and Persian gold began to erode discipline. Some Spartiates indulged in luxuries their ancestors would have scorned. Greed and corruption crept into a society that had been defined by simplicity and shared purpose. The very culture that had forged the most feared warriors of Greece was weakening from within. This combination of a tiny citizen population, constant fear of rebellion, and creeping decadence created cracks in the shield that had once made Sparta invincible. And those cracks would soon be exploited by a new generation of Greek leaders, men who understood both strategy and innovation in ways Sparta never had to. The Battle of Leuctra, 371 BCE, would be the turning point. The Thebans, led by the brilliant General Epaminondas, introduced a new formation, the oblique phalanx, concentrating power against the Spartan flank. For centuries, Sparta had dominated every land battle, but at Leuctra, their forces were shattered. The invincible army was broken, their reputation of land supremacy destroyed in a single, decisive encounter. From that moment, Sparta's dominance began to crumble. Messenia, the source of its Helot labor, was liberated. Without the Helots to farm the land, the warrior class could no longer sustain itself. Spartan society, once feared and admired across Greece, became a shadow of its former glory. Yet, even in decline, the Spartans remained remarkable. Their discipline, courage, and unyielding spirit were still legendary. Tales of Thermopylae and their laconic wit endured, inspiring generations long after Sparta's power had faded. They were a people whose might had peaked and fallen, but whose legend would never die. After the catastrophic loss at Leuctra in 371 BCE, Sparta was no longer the unchallenged master of Greece. Its army, once unbeatable on land, had been shattered. Its economy, dependent on Helot labor, was in crisis, and yet Sparta clung stubbornly to its identity, refusing to adapt to the changing world around it. In the 4th century BCE, Macedon rose under Philip II, a cunning and ambitious leader who sought to unite Greece under his rule. Sparta, weakened but proud, became a target. Philip reportedly sent a warning: "If I invade Laconia, you will be destroyed, never to rise again." The Spartan reply, laconic and defiant, was simply "if." In that single word, they distilled centuries of Spartan courage, stoicism, and unwillingness to bow to outsiders. Despite their bravery, Sparta could not match Macedon's military innovation or political acumen. In 331 BCE, during Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire, King Agis III attempted a revolt against Macedonian dominance, but the effort failed disastrously at the Battle of Megalopolis, proving that even Spartan courage had limits against a more modernized and adaptable enemy. Sparta's days as a major power were over, yet the city-state lingered on, trying to revive its former glory in the Hellenistic era. Kings like Agis IV and Cleomenes III attempted sweeping reforms, redistributing land, restoring military discipline, and expanding citizenship to bolster a dwindling citizen population. These efforts often failed, either crushed by the resistance of the wealthy elite or undermined by external powers. Sparta's rigid traditions, once a source of strength, had become a barrier to survival. By the 2nd century BCE, the Romans emerged as the new dominant force in the Greek world. Sparta, now a minor player, found itself entangled in Roman conflicts. In 195 BCE, Rome defeated Sparta and forced it to join the Achaean League, stripping it of its autonomy. By 146 BCE, when Rome crushed the Achaean League, Sparta, along with the rest of Greece, came under Roman control. And yet, even under Roman rule, Sparta retained a unique allure. Roman elites admired its legendary discipline and austere way of life. Tourists came to observe the remnants of the agoge, to see the streets where warriors had once trained from childhood, and to marvel at the society that had dared to turn discipline into an art. Sparta was no longer a military power, but it had become a living museum, a symbol of an age when courage, unity, and unyielding strength defined a people. Despite its decline, Sparta's legacy endured. Stories of Thermopylae, of the 300, and of their iron discipline were recounted across the Mediterranean. Their society, once feared and hated, became a model of endurance and resilience. Even as the world around them changed, Spartans refused to compromise their identity. They might have lost battles, cities, and political influence, but they never surrendered the principles that had made them legendary. By the time Rome had fully absorbed Greece, Sparta had long ceased to be a military powerhouse. Its phalanxes no longer struck fear across the Peloponnese. Its kings no longer commanded empires, and its citizen population had dwindled to a fraction of its former size. Yet, in the centuries that followed, Sparta's legend did not fade. If anything, it grew. The story of Thermopylae alone ensured that the Spartans would never be forgotten. 300 men, trained from childhood in the harsh crucible of the Agage, stood against a Persian army vastly larger than their own. They fought not for wealth, not for fame, but for honor and duty. Even in death, they delayed the enemy, protected Greece, and inspired generations. That act of courage became a universal symbol of bravery against impossible odds, a reminder that discipline and loyalty could shape history itself. But Sparta's influence went beyond the battlefield. Their society and culture were equally remarkable. The Agog, an education system focused entirely on forging warriors, remains unparalleled in history. Entire generations were raised to endure pain, survive hunger, and prioritize collective strength over personal comfort. It was a system that valued resilience, focus, and the mastery of both body and mind. Spartan women also left a lasting impression. In a world where most women were invisible in public life, Spartan women exercised independence, managed estates, and trained their bodies to produce strong children. They were educated in athletics, poetry, and music, unlike anywhere else in Greece. Their strength, both physical and social, became part of the broader legend of Sparta. Then there was the laconic wit, the Spartan gift for concise, cutting speech. A single word, like the famous if, in response to Philip II of Macedon, could express defiance and confidence that echoed across generations. Short, sharp, and unforgettable, these words reflected the Spartan mindset: direct, unflinching, and powerful. Sparta's influence reached even into the Roman era. Roman elites often visited Sparta as if it were a living museum, marveling at the discipline, rituals, and martial culture that had once made it the most feared city in Greece. The Spartan way inspired later military thinkers, from Roman generals to modern special forces, who admired the combination of rigorous training, teamwork, and unbreakable courage. And today, the myth of Sparta continues to capture the imagination. Movies, books, and popular culture celebrate their courage at Thermopylae, the rigor of their society, and their refusal to compromise principles for comfort or convenience. Sparta wasn't cool because it conquered vast empires. It was cool because it created a society that demanded the extraordinary from every citizen, forged discipline into a way of life, and faced impossible odds with fearless resolve. Even in decline, even as the world moved on, Sparta's legacy endured. It is a story of human potential pushed to its limits, of a civilization that turned hardship into strength, and of a people whose values, discipline, courage, and loyalty still inspire the world. Sparta teaches us that power isn't just measured in victories or territory. It's measured in courage, unity, and the ability to shape a society so thoroughly that it becomes legendary, an ideal that endures long after swords have rusted and walls have crumbled, even after its decline and absorption into the Roman world. Sparta never truly disappeared. Its influence persisted, not in empires or conquests, but in ideas, culture, and inspiration. Sparta became more than a city-state. It became a symbol of human potential pushed to the limits, of discipline so rigorous it seemed almost superhuman, and of courage so legendary it transcended time. Lessons from the Spartan way. The first lesson Sparta offers is that discipline creates freedom. Paradoxically, a society that demanded total obedience, rigorous training, and sacrifice produced citizens who could act with incredible confidence and cohesion. Spartan warriors were bound to the phalanx, but that very bond gave them freedom on the battlefield. Their unity, forged from childhood in the agage, allowed them to face impossible odds without hesitation. Even today, this principle resonates in elite teams, military units, and organizations that rely on trust, discipline, and shared purpose. The second lesson is courage under pressure. Thermopylae remains the ultimate example. 300 men against a army of hundreds of thousands, standing firm because they believed in something greater than themselves. Sparta teaches us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. The third lesson lies in prioritizing what matters. Sparta's focus on strength, endurance, and loyalty over wealth, luxury, or fame created a society that excelled in what it valued most: their refusal to compromise. Even when the world around them changed, offers a striking contrast to civilizations that expand without principle or sacrifice. Sparta's cultural and modern influence. Long after its political power faded, Sparta continued to shape culture. Philosophers, historians, and military strategists studied it as a model of order and courage. The Romans, ever pragmatic, admired Sparta's austere training and discipline. Even modern military forces, from elite special forces to cadet programs, invoke Spartan ideals as guiding principles. Sparta also shaped the idea of the legendary underdog. Stories of Thermopylae, the steadfast hoplites, and the fearless women echo in modern storytelling, inspiring films, books, and video games. The narrative of a small, disciplined force standing against overwhelming odds resonates universally, proving that the essence of Sparta transcends its historical era. The timeless spirit of Sparta. Ultimately, Sparta's lasting appeal is about mindset and values. It wasn't cool because it conquered vast territories or amassed wealth. It was cool because it demanded excellence, courage, and unity from every citizen. From the brutal lessons of the Agogsh to the unwavering loyalty in the phalanx, every Spartan knew that their life was part of a greater purpose. Sparta teaches us that greatness is forged, not given, that the human spirit, disciplined and united, can accomplish feats that seem impossible, and that even when empires fall, ideas endure. The shields may rust, the armies may vanish, and the walls may crumble, but the legend, the ethos of Sparta remains eternal. After the crushing defeat at Leuctra in 371 BCE, Sparta's dominance in Greece was shattered, but the city refused to vanish quietly. Its warriors, though fewer in number, remained proud. Its citizens, though diminished, retained an unbreakable sense of identity, and its kings, ever ambitious, sought to revive the glory that had once made Sparta the unrivaled master of the Peloponnese. Two of the most notable reformers were Agis IV and Cleomenes III, kings who understood that without bold changes, Sparta's society was doomed. The problems were glaring. Land ownership had become concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy elites, leaving many Spartiates impoverished and weakening the citizen base. The Agogsh, once a rigorous system that produced elite warriors, had declined as resources shrank. Helots, once tightly controlled, were restless. Without reforms, the Spartan way of life, its discipline, its martial culture, its very identity, was at risk of disappearing. Agis IV proposed radical measures. He wanted to redistribute land, restoring equality among citizens, and reviving the smallholding farms that had once fed and trained the warrior class. He also attempted to expand citizenship, bringing more men into the ranks of Spartiates to bolster the army, and, crucially, he sought to reintroduce strict military discipline, rebuilding the Agogsh to its former rigor. Yet these reforms faced fierce resistance. The wealthy elites, who had benefited from the old system, saw their power threatened. Agis's efforts were ultimately undermined, and he was executed in 241 BCE, a grim reminder that in Sparta, as elsewhere, reform is dangerous when it challenges entrenched privilege. Not long after, Cleomenes III attempted another revival. Unlike Agis, Cleomenes took a more militaristic approach. He led campaigns to reclaim land, restore the agoge, and revive the citizen population. Cleomenes even defeated some of Sparta's regional enemies, temporarily restoring confidence in Spartan arms. Yet even he could not overcome the structural challenges. The population was too small, Helot unrest persisted, and external powers increasingly interfered in Greek affairs. These reform attempts, though bold, highlight a critical lesson. Sparta's rigid system, once its strength, had become its greatest vulnerability. The very discipline, loyalty, and conservative values that had produced the greatest warriors in Greek history also made it difficult to adapt to changing circumstances. Unlike Athens or Macedon, Sparta could not innovate quickly enough, and the external pressures of the Hellenistic world, rising kingdoms, shifting alliances, and foreign intervention made survival increasingly precarious. By the end of the Hellenistic period, Sparta remained a symbol of resilience and pride, but it was no longer a major player in Greek politics. Its reforms had inspired hope and demonstrated that Spartan ideals were not entirely lost. Yet the reality was clear. The era of Sparta as an invincible power was over. Even in decline, however, these efforts left a lasting impression. Agis IV and Cleomenes III are remembered not for the wars they won, but for their ambition to restore a society defined by courage, discipline, and equality. They remind us that even in the face of structural collapse, bold vision and the pursuit of ideals can leave a mark on history. By the 4th century BCE, Sparta's power had already waned. The crushing defeat at Leuctra, combined with failed reforms, had left the once mighty city-state vulnerable. Yet, true to its character, Sparta refused to surrender its identity, even as new empires rose on the horizon. The first of these challenges came from Macedon. Philip II, a brilliant strategist and shrewd politician, sought to unite Greece under his banner. Sparta, though weakened, remained defiant. When Philip reportedly warned, "If I invade Laconia, you will be destroyed, never to rise again," the Spartan reply was famously laconic. If, in just one word, the Spartans conveyed centuries of pride, courage, and stubborn independence, Philip's son, Alexander the Great, would later extend Macedonian influence across the known world, conquering Persia and beyond. During this era, Sparta largely stayed on the sidelines, too diminished to challenge the Macedonian juggernaut directly. However, in 331 BCE, King Agis III attempted a revolt against Macedonian dominance, hoping to restore Spartan autonomy. The rebellion failed at the Battle of Megalopolis, a stark demonstration that Spartan valor alone could no longer secure victory against modernized armies and coordinated states. Despite this setback, Sparta lingered on, clinging to its traditions and identity. Even as Hellenistic kingdoms rose and fell around them, Spartan culture, the agoge, military discipline, and social values remained intact, at least in spirit. By the 2nd century BCE, a new and even greater power emerged: Rome. Sparta, now a shadow of its former self, found itself entangled in conflicts with the rising republic. In 195 BCE, Roman forces defeated Sparta and forced it to join the Achaean League, stripping it of autonomy. Sparta was no longer the master of its destiny. It became a participant in a political game controlled by external powers. Finally, in 146 BCE, Rome crushed the Achaean League, and Greece, including Sparta, was fully incorporated into the Roman world. Yet, even under Roman control, Sparta's legend endured. Roman elites admired the discipline, courage, and austerity of the Spartans, often visiting the city to witness remnants of the Agog and observe its warrior traditions. Sparta had become a living museum, a symbol of a society that had once turned discipline and loyalty into an art form. Sparta's struggle against Macedon and Rome highlights both the limits and the resilience of its culture. Militarily, politically, and demographically, the city-state could no longer dominate. Yet culturally and symbolically, Sparta retained power beyond its size or wealth. Its reputation for courage, self-discipline, and unyielding identity allowed it to remain relevant in the imagination of future generations. Even in the shadow of empires, Sparta exemplified the principle that true strength is not measured only in territory or armies, but in values, resilience, and the courage to uphold them against overwhelming odds. Though Sparta's political and military power had long faded, its legacy endured, echoing across centuries and continents. What makes Sparta remarkable isn't just its victories or defeats, but the values it embodied: discipline, courage, unity, and an unyielding commitment to principles. These qualities turned a small, isolated city-state into a legend that still captivates the imagination today. The first and most obvious part of Sparta's legacy is its military ethos. The story of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans faced overwhelming odds, remains one of the most iconic tales of heroism in history. Their willingness to stand firm, to fight and die for the greater good, resonates far beyond Greece. Modern militaries, from elite special forces to cadet programs, study Spartan discipline and phalanx tactics, not just for strategy, but as a model of cohesion, courage, and teamwork. Sparta also left a mark in societal structure and values. The Agog, the rigorous system of education and military training, is remembered as one of the most extreme attempts in history to shape citizens from childhood. Spartan society demonstrated how collective discipline, rigorous training, and a focus on purpose could forge extraordinary human potential. Even today, leaders and educators reference the Spartan model when discussing resilience, leadership, and teamwork. Spartan women also contribute to the enduring fascination. In a world where most women were excluded from public life, Spartan women enjoyed property rights, physical training, and social influence. Their independence, strength, and education made them an integral part of the Spartan identity, challenging gender norms of the ancient world and leaving a legacy of empowerment that echoes through history. Then there is the laconic wit, the power of brevity and clarity. A single word, like the famous if, in response to Philip II, can communicate defiance, confidence, and identity. Spartans mastered the art of saying more with less, a lesson in communication, focus, and courage. that remains surprisingly relevant in leadership, strategy, and storytelling. Culturally, Sparta continues to inspire. Films, books, and games dramatize their courage, discipline, and societal uniqueness. The term Spartan has become synonymous with toughness, endurance, and unyielding principles. The image of the warrior standing firm against overwhelming odds is a universal symbol of perseverance, courage, and the human spirit. Even in decline, even as Rome dominated and the city faded into history, Sparta remained immortal in ideals. Its influence extended into Roman admiration, Renaissance thought, modern military culture, and global popular imagination. Sparta proves that a society's greatest power can reside not in armies or wealth, but in principles, courage, and legacy. Ultimately, Sparta teaches us that greatness is forged, not inherited, that courage is measured by action in the face of fear, and that discipline, unity, and unwavering adherence to values can create a legend that lasts millennia. The shields may rust, the armies may vanish, and the city may crumble, but the ethos of Sparta, its spirit of fearlessness and endurance, remains eternal. For centuries, Sparta had been the unchallenged master of Greek land warfare. Its hoplites, forged in the Agogs, had crushed enemies across the Peloponnese. Its phalanx formation was legendary for discipline and cohesion. Its warriors were taught from childhood to endure pain, obey orders without question, and value collective strength above all. Invincibility seemed inherent to the Spartan way. Yet, all of that changed in 371 BCE at the small town of Leuctra in Boeotia. The Spartans faced a rising power, Thebes, led by the brilliant and innovative General Epaminondas. Unlike Sparta's conservative, rigid approach, Epaminondas embraced strategy and ingenuity, introducing tactics designed specifically to exploit Spartan weaknesses. The key innovation was the oblique phalanx. Instead of matching the Spartans with a traditional line, Epaminondas concentrated his forces on the Spartan right flank, creating a massive spearhead aimed at breaking their strongest point. This tactical brilliance caught Sparta by surprise. Their centuries of battlefield dominance did not prepare them for an enemy willing to bend the rules of engagement so dramatically. The battle itself was catastrophic for Sparta. Despite their legendary discipline, the Spartans were overwhelmed. Many of their elite warriors fell, and their reputation of invincibility, hard won over centuries, was shattered in a single engagement. The psychological blow was just as devastating as the physical losses. Sparta, long feared and respected, was no longer untouchable. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The Thebans marched into the Peloponnese, liberating Messenia and freeing the Helots, who had supported Sparta's military economy for generations. Without Helot labor, the Spartan warrior class could no longer sustain itself. Farms went untended, the agog faltered, and the society that had produced some of the greatest warriors in history began to crumble from within. Yet even in defeat, the Spartans retained their courage and pride. Unlike many empires that collapse quietly, Sparta remained resilient in identity. refusing to abandon its values or surrender its ethos. The Battle of Leuctra marked the end of their dominance, but not the end of their legend. This defeat also highlighted a critical lesson. Rigid discipline and tradition, while powerful, cannot always withstand innovation, adaptation, and clever strategy. Sparta's fall at Leuctra illustrates how even the most disciplined societies are vulnerable when they cannot evolve to meet new challenges. After Athens fell in 404 BCE, Sparta ascended to the pinnacle of Greek power. For the first time in centuries, the city-state that had been a formidable regional force became the hegemon of all Greece. Spartan soldiers patrolled the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Oligarchic governments loyal to Sparta were installed in cities across the Aegean, and the long walls of Athens were torn down, a symbolic gesture that marked the end of Athenian independence and the triumph of Spartan land power. Sparta's dominance was remarkable, not only militarily, but also politically. They enforced order through fear, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. The Peloponnesian League expanded its influence, ensuring that cities aligned themselves with Spartan interests or risked Spartan intervention. This was a society that had spent centuries perfecting discipline, and now that discipline extended beyond its borders, shaping the fate of Greece itself. Yet, even at its zenith, Sparta faced deep structural challenges. Its small citizen population, possibly fewer than 8,000 full Spartiates at the peak, limited its ability to maintain control over such a vast sphere of influence. Every war, every campaign, every death in battle reduced the already fragile citizen base, and there was no influx of new Spartiates to replace them. The system that had created elite warriors was now becoming unsustainable. The Helots, who had once been subjugated to sustain Sparta's warriors, remained a constant concern. Outnumbering the Spartiates 7-1, they were an ever-present internal threat. Any attempt by Sparta to expand or assert dominance required careful attention to prevent rebellion at home, attention that constantly drained resources and attention. Moreover, Sparta's rigid adherence to its traditional values, which had once been its greatest strength, now created friction. Wealth from empire and tribute began to accumulate among a small elite, undermining the egalitarian ideals that had once held Spartan society together. Some citizens abandoned the old agoge training or pursued personal comfort, weakening the cohesion and discipline that had defined Sparta for centuries. Even in power, Sparta's strength was precarious. Military dominance could mask societal fragility, but the cracks were evident. The very system that had produced legendary warriors, unyielding in battle, disciplined, and united, was not equipped to adapt to demographic decline, internal inequality, or the rise of clever enemies like Thebes and eventually Macedon. Still, at this moment, Sparta seemed unstoppable. Its army was feared across Greece, its allies obedient, and its enemies cautious. This was the era of Spartan pride at its absolute height, a society that had mastered warfare, governance, and discipline, and was shaping the destiny of Greece itself. The Peloponnesian War had entered its most decisive phase by 413 BCE. Athens, once the undisputed maritime superpower, had suffered catastrophic losses in the Sicilian expedition. Sparta, traditionally a land-based power, saw an opportunity not only to challenge Athens on land, but to contest dominance at sea. The turning point came with the establishment of the Spartan garrison at Decelea, strategically positioned in Attica. This permanent fortification allowed Sparta to control the surrounding countryside, cutting Athens off from critical resources, farmland, and supplies. Spartan raids disrupted the Athenian economy, while the Athenians were trapped behind their walls, increasingly dependent on dwindling food stores and naval resupply. But conquering Athens by land was not enough. Sparta needed naval power, and for centuries, that had been its weakness. Enter Persia, whose rulers saw an opportunity to weaken Athens and destabilize the Greek world. With Persian gold, Sparta built a fleet capable of challenging Athens on the sea, a bold transformation for a society that had long relied solely on hoplites and land strategy. Commanders like Lysander turned this new naval force into a precision instrument of war, using strategy, timing, and the advantage of surprise. The Spartan navy began to dominate the Aegean. They disrupted trade, intercepted supply lines, and gradually strangled the Athenian economy. It was a complete reversal. Athens, the empire of the sea, was now vulnerable on its own waters. The decisive moment arrived at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BCE. Lysander's fleet ambushed the Athenians while they were anchored and unprepared. In a matter of hours, the Spartan navy destroyed the Athenian fleet almost entirely, capturing sailors, ships, and supplies. With their navy shattered, Athens could no longer secure grain from overseas or project power across the Aegean. Starvation and isolation forced the city to surrender in 404 BCE. Sparta's victory was historic. For the first time, the land-based warriors had mastered the seas, combining strategic foresight, financial support from Persia, and innovative leadership to topple Athens. The consequences were profound. Athens' empire was dismantled, its walls torn down, and Spartan influence now extended across the Greek world. Yet, even at the height of power, challenges lingered. Sparta's population was small, helots were restless, and maintaining control over allies and conquered territories required constant vigilance. The victory over Athens demonstrated Spartan adaptability and strategic genius, but it also masked deeper vulnerabilities that would resurface in the decades to come. By 415 BCE, Athens had grown bold and ambitious. Flush with power, wealth, and confidence after decades of dominance, the city-state decided to strike far from home. The target, Syracuse in Sicily, a prosperous and strategically crucial city allied with Sparta. Athens aimed to expand its influence, secure new resources, and demonstrate its supremacy across the Greek world. The decision proved catastrophic. Athens underestimated the logistical challenges of a long-distance campaign. Supplies, coordination, and communication were stretched to their limits. The Athenian generals faced unfamiliar terrain, local resistance, and a determined Sicilian defense that proved far more resilient than expected. Meanwhile, Morale began to falter as the expedition dragged on. Sparta, ever opportunistic, seized the moment. Though its strength had traditionally been on land, the Peloponnesian League rallied to support Syracuse covertly. Spartan generals advised and coordinated efforts to stall and counter Athens' advances. This indirect involvement allowed Sparta to weaken Athens without committing fully to a distant battlefield, demonstrating strategic cunning. The tide turned decisively when the Athenians attempted a retreat. The Sicilian forces, reinforced and well prepared, annihilated much of the Athenian fleet and killed thousands of soldiers. The defeat was one of the greatest military disasters in Greek history. Not only did Athens lose men, ships, and resources, but its aura of invincibility, built over decades of naval dominance, was irreparably damaged. For Sparta, the Sicilian expedition's failure was a turning point. Athens was weakened, its empire destabilized, and its allies began to question its authority. Sparta could now focus on the war in Greece itself, leveraging Athens' missteps to establish strategic advantages on land and soon at sea. The momentum had shifted. The Sicilian disaster highlights a critical lesson. Ambition without strategy, even by the most powerful state, can lead to devastating consequences. Sparta, patient and disciplined, capitalized on Athens' overreach, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by direct confrontation, but by exploiting the mistakes of others. After the Persian Wars, Greece was not united, it was divided. Athens, having emerged as the wealthiest and most powerful city-state, dominated the seas and led the Delian League, a naval alliance initially intended to defend Greece from future Persian invasions. Over time, Athens transformed this league into an empire, demanding tribute from allies and extending its influence across the Aegean. Its democracy flourished, its navy was unrivaled, and its cultural achievements, art, philosophy, and architecture, made it the jewel of Greece. Sparta, by contrast, remained the guardian of land power and tradition. Its citizens were warriors, trained from youth to uphold discipline, courage, and loyalty to the city-state. Sparta's governance was conservative, oligarchic, and focused on military excellence, while Athens celebrated creativity, commerce, and democracy. Sparta prized simplicity, order, and the battlefield. This clash of values, ideologies, and interests made war inevitable. In 431 BCE, the Peloponnesian War began, pitting Athens and its allies against Sparta and the Peloponnesian League. The conflict was not just about territory or power, it was a battle of civilizations, contrasting innovation against tradition, democracy against oligarchy, and naval supremacy against land dominance. The opening phase, known as the Archidamian War, was named after King Archidamus II of Sparta. Sparta's strategy was methodical. Annually invade Attica, ravage the land, and pressure Athens to come out and fight on land where Sparta excelled. The Athenians, under leaders like Pericles, avoided direct confrontation, relying instead on their walls and naval superiority to defend the city. This early phase of the war highlighted a deadly strategic stalemate. Athens could raid the Peloponnesian coast with its fleet, while Sparta struck Attica by land. Both sides tested each other, probing weaknesses and exploiting any misstep, yet neither could secure a decisive victory for years. Disaster struck Athens internally in 430 BCE. A plague swept through the city, killing perhaps a third of its population, including Pericles himself. The epidemic shifted the balance, demonstrating that in war, factors beyond strategy, disease, logistics, and morale could decide outcomes. Sparta, still formidable, could continue its campaigns. But the conflict was far from over. The Peloponnesian Wars beginning set the tone for decades of grueling, unpredictable warfare, showcasing the strengths and vulnerabilities of both great powers. Athens' overreach, Sparta's discipline, and the relentless clash of ideology and strategy made this war one of the most epic and consequential in ancient history. Thermopylae had shown the world the courage and discipline of the Spartans. But the war against Persia was far from over. While King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans fought to the death, the larger Greek alliance had to prepare for the next stage, a conflict that would decide the fate of all of Greece. After Thermopylae, Persian forces advanced into central Greece, burning Athens and leaving the city in ruins. The Greeks, however, had not been defeated. Their naval forces, led by Athens, regrouped and prepared for a critical confrontation in the narrow straits near Salamis. Here, the Greeks would use strategy, knowledge of the terrain, and coordination to turn the tide. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greek fleet, though outnumbered, lured the massive Persian navy into the narrow channels, where the Persians' numerical advantage became a liability. Triremes maneuvered skillfully, ramming enemy ships and creating chaos. The result was a stunning Greek victory, crippling the Persian fleet and securing control of the seas. Sparta's role, though primarily focused on land, remained influential in coordinating alliances and maintaining morale. The following year, in 479 BCE, the Greeks met the Persian army on land at Plataea. This battle marked the final showdown of the Persian invasion. Spartan leadership was central. King Pausanias commanded the Greek forces, organizing a diverse coalition of city-states into a unified army. The Spartans, true to their training, held the most critical positions, their discipline proving decisive as waves of Persian troops were repelled. The Persians suffered massive losses and were finally forced to retreat. The aftermath of these victories solidified Sparta's reputation as the protector of Greece. Its land army, unparalleled in training and courage, had played a pivotal role in safeguarding Greek civilization from a vast empire. The stories of Spartan bravery, from Thermopylae to Plataea, became legendary, celebrated in poetry, oral tradition, and later historical accounts. Sparta's cool factor during this period was undeniable. Their soldiers fought with unwavering discipline against impossible odds. Their strategic sacrifices inspired other Greek city-states to unite and resist Persia. Their laconic wit and simplicity became a hallmark of their identity, symbolizing courage and stoicism. Yet, even in victory, the seeds of future rivalry were planted. Athens, having led the naval battles, began to rise in influence, foreshadowing the ideological and military conflicts that would erupt in the Peloponnesian War decades later. Sparta's legacy as a military powerhouse was secure, but it was now one power among several competing for dominance in Greece. In the end, Sparta is more than history. It is a reminder that discipline, courage, and loyalty can define not only warriors, but societies, and that the story of a few brave men and women can echo across millennia, inspiring anyone who dares to live boldly. From the hills of Laconia to the annals of history, from Thermopylae to the imagination of modern generations, Sparta remains immortal, not through conquest, but through the ideals it embodied: courage, discipline, unity. This is the true legacy of Sparta, and it still challenges us to ask, if we faced the impossible, could we be Spartan?